만들었습니다. 일본은 역사이고 즉각 정리하라.
한일 근대사는 늘 뜨거운 감자입니다. 역사적 사실을 둘러싸고 첨예한 대립이 이어지죠. 한국인도 일본인도 아닌데 이 문제를 깊이 파고든 이가 있습니다. 과거의 사건이지만 오늘의 사건이기도 한 일들. 제3자의 시선으로 보는 한일 근대사는 과연 어떤 느낌일까요? 전 세계에 흩어져 있는 위대한 생각들을 모았습니다. 어떤 생각은 우리를 저 먼 곳으로 데려갑니다.
Hello, EBS viewers. Welcome to Widaehan Suop, Great Minds. My name is Alexis Dudden. I'm professor of history at the University of Connecticut. We're going to be discussing Korea and Japan's modern history. With this first treaty in 1876, many Koreans, it's not that they didn't understand what was happening, it just wasn't, it wasn't published in any newspaper because newspapers were not even in existence yet. As a result of Japan's growing influence in Korea, however, some young Koreans, known as the Independence Club eventually, began to realize that they probably needed to study what the Japanese were doing. Similar to how Japanese realized they needed to study what the British, Americans, and French had been doing. And so a group of young men, particularly So Jae-pil is the most famous of these, began to study in Japan and take study trips to Japan. And again, this is tricky because when we look at it from today, we use these terms such as pro-Japanese, pro-Chinese, pro-this, anti-that. Again, if you think in terms of what was happening in the palaces in Seoul at the time, it was infighting, intrigue, who could jockey for power among the king. And then there were several younger people saying, we need to study how Japan is preventing itself from being taken over. And that's what led to the first young Koreans studying in Japan. And so when we talk about the modern relationship between Japan and Korea, it's not all negative. And I guess that's what I want to emphasize because we're talking about people such as Kim Il-gyun, who will study at Keio University with Fukuzawa Yukichi and learn these notions of civilization and modernity, and then want to bring them back to Korea and want to have Koreans consider a new form of learning and a new form of orienting themselves to the greater world. It is just a reality, however, that the great powers were at once not interested in dispelling Japan. The powers, and this is where racial politics come into play very much, because the British and Americans and French begin describing the Japanese as the whites of Asia, and that maybe the Japanese could do something helpful in civilizing other Asians. This is also self-consciously the language that Japanese imperialists or empire builders are using to describe their adventures overseas. It begins to be something seen as a civilizing mission, Japan's responsibility. And again, this is not a question of picking sides. This is the language that's used by Japanese the architects of what will become a massive empire that takes over Asia. in the mix is this beginning, the seeds of dislodging Korea from China, from a traditional relationship, and creating the notion of Korea as an independent nation with sovereignty and power to its own. The catch, however, is that in this treaty of 1876, the Japanese also announced that their nationals, Japanese, will not be judged by Korean laws. And they also introduced this notion of extraterritoriality. So when we talk about Japan creating a sort of defensive strategy as it was building its empire in the early stages, it very much connects with a moment called the Seikanron, which is the conquered Korea debate of 1871. This was several Japanese politicians in the Meiji government who had been stripped of their status as samurai and were now bureaucrats, were reeling from the fact that they were no longer in the kind of authority that they had been in when they had been in the samurai order of the Tokugawa shogunate. And they wanted to go and expand Japan's prestige, particularly after what was they perceived as an affront by the Korean king at the time, who did not recognize that the emperor of Japan was higher than he was. Japan's Tokugawa shogun had been listed equally with the Korean king. And then when Japan had its modern Isshin, its revolution in 1868, it had an emperor. And so it announced to Korea that it was on par with China. And the Koreans did not recognize that, which certain Japanese politicians took as an affront and wanted to go conquer Korea as early as 1871. At that very juncture, however, a number of very powerful Japanese politicians, still very young, including Ito Hirobumi, were on an around-the-world study tour called the Iwakura Mission. And they were visiting the capitals of the world, the great power capitals of the world. And when they heard that there was a debate at home to go conquer Korea at the time, several of them cut their trip short and hurried back to Tokyo and said, no, 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 no. If we expose ourselves militarily, we will be conquered, because we're not ready to do this yet, because they had watched the Prussian army train, they had watched the French army train, they had seen the budding industrial systems of England and the United States, and they knew Japan was not ready to expose itself. And I guess that's what I think is important to consider, how this was a staged effort at empire building. Now that's different from what Japan will do in the north in creating Ezo into Hokkaido, which arguably in terms of internal colonialism, it does right away. And that's kind of interesting because they do that modeled on the American frontier model. And they even have, they hire American advisors who have fought in the so-called American Indian Wars and to conquer Manifest Destiny style the United States. So internally in Japan, they try that first and turn Hokkaido into the first of Japan's colonial possessions. It's an inside colony, very different from Korea, which at the time, of course, was still serving China and in a different tributary relationship with China. So the people who will be remembered as the great nation builders in Japan, particularly Ito Hirobumi, Okuma Shigenobu, and many others, said, we're not ready to do this, and upset people who wanted to expand Japan, or at least assert Japan's greatness abroad at the time. What I'd like everyone to think about again in this first moment is that Japan's efforts to colonize are a defensive effort to save Japan. more than necessarily take over Korea from the beginning, because they're really testing whether or not the West is going to let them do this. And it's precisely that they're insecure. They don't know whether or not the Americans and the English are going to let them do this. And then eventually, this will lead to Japan's first modern war against China, 1894 to 95. And no one expected Japan to defeat China. Then there's also the question of how best to remember Kim Il-gyun. Many consider Kim Il-gyun a hero, a great reformer. He certainly, again, he's made for movies. This guy, he was back and forth to Japan. He took all sorts of trips. Almost he hid himself. He went to the Ogasawara Islands, which are 1,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. And he really was actively trying to learn what was working for Japan. He was also open to going to China to see whether he could figure out a way to negotiate on behalf of Japan with China. He also met with a lot of resistance, because he was considered too pro-Japanese and too open to Japan. And many people were not ready for the kind of vision that he had. That's when he was assassinated by a fellow a countryman. What's interesting about his murder is that the Japanese government regarded him as probably their most important intellect in Korea, and they used his assassination as justification to launch into the first modern war, the first war against China, 1894 to 95. So they claimed that they were avenging Kim Il-gyun's death by attacking China. And I think what's also important to think about the names of Japan's first modern wars, the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War that'll come in 10 more years, is that these are actually wars fought for control of Korea, yet they've erased Korea already in the name. So if that makes sense, it's the Sino-Japanese War, but the winner is going to gain more rights in Korea, because that's the prize that Japan wins by defeating China. In the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China agrees to declare Korea an independent nation. And so again, this is a kind of reflexive, defensive empire move or great game move that Japan is maneuvering in dislodging China as the arbiter of power. What I also find really instructive about the Treaty of Shimonoseki is that at the end of it, it says, if there's any confusion between the Japanese and Chinese texts, we will rely on the English translation of this text. And that's the first time that English is inserted in power politics in Asia, where it continues to this day. So that diplomatic treaty language is still referred to, the ultimate legal document is the English document. And that's when we think about the centuries of brush talking, how China could define knowledge and power. Japan has effectively kicked China out of that role, which arguably is as important as defeating China militarily. So it's this fusion of words and power that Japan achieves by 1895, just as Korea is about to reform itself. It's in the wake of this moment that Korean reformers achieve new national consciousness for Korea, changing the name of the country to the Empire of Great Han in 1897, changing the name of King Kojong to Emperor Kojong And so just as this moment of great excitement is happening inside Korea because the reformers have encouraged leaders in Korea to recognize the power of nationalism, the power of creating a Korean consciousness, Japan is going to step up militarily its actions of takeover.